I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today we have the pleasure of talking with John Pace. John was sentenced to die in prison at the age of 17 under a Pennsylvania felony murder statute that required the judge to give him a sentence of life. John served 31 years before he was finally released after a change in Supreme Court law. Since returning home in 2017, John has been supporting other men and women who were children when they were sentenced to die in prison, and he's been featured in The Nation magazine, CBS Morning News, and NPR for his work. John currently lives in Philadelphia, where he serves as the Senior Reentry Coordinator at the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project and as a program associate for the Inside Out Prison Exchange at Temple University. John, welcome to the show.
It is a pleasure. It's a pleasure, really a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you and to be able to just engage in conversation about the work that I do and what my experience has been.
And John, before we get too deep into this interview, I know you heard me just introduce you, but I'm wondering if you could take a minute and share with us who you are and where you are today.
All right. So again, thank you for inviting me. As you said, my name is John Pace, and I currently work with the Youth Sentencing Reentry Project. And my job as a Senior Reentry Coordinator is to work with young people who unfortunately find themselves involved in the criminal justice system, which is I utilize my experience. And part of that, is because I was at the age of 17, once sentenced to die in prison. And I had to go through that experience, spent 31 years in prison. While when there, I took advantage of opportunities that were presented to me, or just the fact that I knew that I wanted to be better. So I took advantage of the opportunities and involved myself in programs that I thought would be beneficial to me. And so eventually, because of the U.S. Supreme Court decision, it allowed me the opportunity to come home. And so now I'm in a position where I can utilize all that experience, that 31 years, to be able to help young people who are going through that similar experience to navigate the challenges that come with, unfortunately, find themselves involved in the system.
So let's just get right to it. I mean, I'd like to start actually in the middle to end of your prison sentence. You'd been incarcerated for, as I said, 31 years when you were finally released. But the thing that triggered your release was this Supreme Court decision, Miller versus Alabama. In Miller versus Alabama, the court said no one who's a juvenile, who's a child, should be sentenced to a mandatory life sentence. The Supreme Court said we need to have individualized considerations. We need the judge to be able to say, hey, is this the person that really does deserve life without parole? And I'm wondering, there you are in prison. There's never been any hint really that you were going to be eligible for release. How did you first learn about Miller? And when did you realize it might actually give you a path forward?
I journeyed to the Miller decision, I think probably a little bit different than many other people because I was actually engaged in legal work. I'm a certified paralegal. And so I was like really engaged in legal work. And also it's fortunate and unfortunate. At one particular time, I had my case go to the U.S. Supreme Court because that's very rare that a criminal case reached the U.S. Supreme Court. But I was arguing the issue about time bar. Pennsylvania had instituted these time bars that to try to streamline individuals appealing cases. And so my case went up, got denied in the state court. I went to the federal court, and ultimately the federal court granted it to me. And then a higher, like a Third Circuit court, overturned their decision. And so the lawyers that were on the case decided, let's take this to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they accepted it. And I had a 5-4 decision against me. And I bring up all that because it was in the midst of that I learned about a number of cases that had gone through the U.S. Supreme Court. I worked in the law library where I was at. I think I paid particular attention to what was going on.
Pennsylvania in particular was like the capital of juvenile life without parole sentences. So you were really well situated. I mean, to the extent that any, being well situated can be defined in this way, you were well situated to have your sentence reconsidered. And so you eventually were released. You were released, I think, in 2017. And you had, as I said, served over 3 decades in prison. What was that like for you?
So as you can imagine, I went to prison at 17 and I had no real adult experiences at the age of 17. And so all, for the most part, most of my adult, the 20s, 30s, and then I was in like midway through my 40s when this decision came through. And so most of my adult life had been in prison. Not most, all of my adult life had been in prison. I think what happens is, and that's most human beings do, you adapt to whatever the circumstances. So for the most part, I was adapting to that environment. I was learning how to navigate that environment, and one of the things I try to do is, I think, and I was fortunate, is that I was pretty much engaged in a lot of programs. I was like involved with organizations. My involvement with the Temple Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, it happened while I was incarcerated. I took a class and then I was invited to become a part of a think tank. And so I was a part of the think tank for like good 10, 15 years. And I was part of training instructors, professors coming in to teach that particular pedagogy. So I was like really engaged with community members. And so I think in many ways, I think that kept me curious and it kept me stimulated about the outside world. I didn't keep my focus about inside of prison. It was about focus of, if the opportunity presented itself, how am I prepared to take advantage of it? But that didn't come without some level of nervousness because I hadn't had the experience.
Yeah, and I was going to get there later, but let's go there now. You just mentioned the Inside Out program. For people who don't know what that is, could you, I mean, I know that you are now a program associate for Temple's Inside Out Prison Exchange, but can you help us understand what is that program?
So the Temple Inside Out Prison Exchange Program is a program where there's a professor named Lori Pompa who once, her story is that she used to teach classes inside of prison, bringing students in prison just as a volunteer. And so she decided to take some students up to a state prison to sit around and have a conversation with men who were once serving life sentence or who were serving life sentence at the time. And the conversation was so engaging that one of the men suggested that you should consider like having a semester long class like this. And she said, I thought about it, but I just knew that was too far because the prisons, for the most part, state prisons are a distance from the city. But what she did was she just started bringing students in consistently in the county prison. And then eventually she decided that she wanted to try to get to Greater Ford, which is where I was at, which is like a little less than an hour outside of Philadelphia. She decided to talk to one of the guys who was the president of the Lifers organization about this idea. And he spoke to the administrators and they were able to get the first class. And what the class consists of, so it was like half outside students teaching, learning on a campus, and half inside students, men who are incarcerated. It's about dialogue. It's about, the professor putting topics up there to allow the class to engage in conversation that they can learn from one another. And so it's not the traditional college classes where you have an instructor that sits in front of the class and lecture and you got to take notes. No, what it is that the class is engaged on a particular topic and we all put in our individual collective knowledge or experience or what we take from the subject into the conversation. And so I participated in that class like 2003. In the 2004, I was invited to the think tank, and I was a part of the think tank until I left. And some of the things, what we did is we expanded the program. We said, okay, this experience was so dynamic. Let's begin to teach other professors and instructors throughout the world to do the same particular model. And so that's what we did. We developed a curriculum and we began to do trainings at Greater Ford Prison. We had instructors coming from around the world to be trained at Greater Ford Prison. And so I actually literally trained over probably like 600 instructors on how to teach an inside out class.
Yeah, I mean, Inside Out is such an impactful program, and it is around the country. I didn't realize you were part of the sort of beginnings.
I was a part of the beginning. And you know, one of the essence of it, when you think about what it does, what it really does, yes, it's about dialogue, it's about engagement, but it really, when you think about the core of it, is about us learning from each other. You know, Brian Stevenson often talks about proximity, and that's what it really is. It's about putting us in proximity to one another, that we can begin to learn from one another, because oftentimes we are separated and we think that we are different. But when we get the opportunity to engage in these conversations and in spaces close to each other, we begin to realize that we have a lot in common. And that's what often happens when we got in those classes. Like, you saw that level of magic that actually took place. And that's why so many people love the experience of Inside Out.
I mean, so many times people who are incarcerated are sort of othered, right? They're referred to as monsters and then locked away and forgotten. And this is just an opportunity to re-engage in the humanity of the people who are both incarcerated and connect them to people who aren't.
And it goes both ways. Outside students, as well as those who are inside, having preconceived notions about outside people and what outside people think about them.
That's a great point. But one of the things that you managed to do, and I'm fascinated by this. So you were serving a life without parole sentence, and somehow you managed to earn your associate's degree and then a bachelor's of arts degree from Villanova University with minors in criminal justice and sociology. You did this all while you were incarcerated.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how did that even happen? Because one thing people don't understand often is that people who are serving life without parole sentences are often denied access to these types of programs, to college programming, for instance. So how did that work for you?
So when I first went to prison, 1985, 86, I went to state prison. Pell Grants still exist. And so one of the things is I had in my mind is that I knew I wanted to be different. I wanted to do different. I often think about my mother and the shame that she had to have experienced with her son being charged with homicide. Because I just remember us both crying, when we were told what my situation was. And so I remember all that. And so one of my goals were I wanted to go and do something different. Part of that difference was that I wanted to go to college. And so I went into prison with that particular mindset. I got to Camp Hill prison when I first got there. And when I first got to Camp Hill prison, I got my GED right away. Then I attempted to enroll in college, but they only take a certain many people. And so I wasn't one of the ones they selected initially. A few years passed. Camp Hill has a major riot. I eventually got transferred out of Camp Hill and I go to Huntington prison. And so when I go to Huntington prison, I'm still working and I'm still doing a lot of constructive stuff. Then eventually I meet an individual who had attained his PhD while incarcerated. He had been incarcerated probably like over 10 or 15 years more than me. And so me and him began to engage in conversation. And then we thought about, okay, let's try to get you in college now. Now, by this time, Pell Grants no longer exist now because they decided to do away with Pell Grants. And part of the reason they decided to do away with Pell Grants because particularly when it came to lifers, they said, you're going to be spending the rest of your life in prison. Why should we invest in you? And so one of the things that we talked about was, okay, let's tell my story and let me write some letters to small businesses and churches to see if we can get someone to sponsor me to go to college. And so I was fortunate that a church responded. And the church, after hearing my story, and one of the things the benefit too is that I was engaged in programs. I was engaged with the Lifers organization. And so the church consulted one of the people who used to be working with Prison Society and said, do you know John Pace? And she said, yes, I know John Pace. I got this wonderful letter from him, and he's trying to ask us to do this. What you think about him? They said, oh, no, he's a wonderful person. And that was the beginning of my college experience. So they sponsored me to go to college, and I took an independent studies course from Penn State. And so that was my very beginning. Then I took a few courses where I had to pay the full tuition because lifers couldn't take the program unless you paid the full tuition. But I couldn't obviously pay all, but I paid for 2 classes. I subsequently got transferred to Greater Ford. And when I got transferred to Greater Ford, I heard about Villanova University. When many of the colleges had decided to disappear because they weren't getting Pell Grants, they weren't getting money or funding. Villanova was one of the universities that continued to provide that education. Now, it took longer, but they still provided that free education. And they didn't say you had to be someone going to be released within a certain amount of years. They didn't discriminate against no one. They said everyone can have this opportunity. And so I enrolled in the program like 1998 when I got transferred to Greater Fort. And I was in the program for an extended period of time because, again, they didn't have the funds where you can go through in 4 years like that. And so it took much longer. And so I used to just take the classes as they come. And then eventually I reached the point where I was able to get my associate's degree. And then eventually came point to get my bachelor's. And so one of the things I was thinking about when I chose the area, I always thought about that I wanted to work with young people. Villanova brought in a lot of sociology classes, and I enjoyed a lot of those classes. And then I started really understanding the dynamics and the value of it. And so when it came to picking minors and stuff, I said, okay, I'm taking so many of these classes here. Part of the goal is that once I got out, I wanted to go get my master's in social work. It seemed like it was so natural, criminal justice and sociology. It just seemed like it was such a natural fit because of the work that I wanted to do, and I think where my experience was at for the most part.
Wow. Well, first of all, kudos to Villanova. That's amazing. Kudos to you. And you do make a really good point about differential access to all kinds of programming and the fact that Pell Grants were such a lifeline for so long for so many incarcerated people to really better themselves and gain that broad depth range of knowledge, and then to have it cut. And so you got out with this degree, although without a lot of life experience, as you noted. And you currently have a job as the reentry coordinator at the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. And for folks who aren't familiar with that amazing organization, Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project, they work to keep children out of prison in the first place, and they help to bring home people who were sentenced to juvenile life without parole, which some people call JLWOP. And so you're a reentry coordinator. What is it that you do? What's your work?
So first, I want to say I am so thankful to the two young, brilliant lawyers, Lauren Fine and Joanna Visser Adjoin, who decided to start an organization to deal with a need that they saw existing in Philadelphia, which was that need to be able to treat children as children, to recognize children's humanity, to recognize being able to treat them in a dignified way, and to just simply look at the more holistic picture of why children find themselves, unfortunately, involved in the circumstances that they found themselves in. They used to come up to Greater Fort Prison, and I remember because as I told you, you'd be involved. I used to be a paralegal. Well, I am a paralegal, but I used to work in the law clinic at the time, and I used to read the legal telegentas. That's just updates about legal situations that occurred. And I remember reading an article about just about these two women who I'd already known already, but I seen them like, whoa, what they doing? And they were talking about how they started this organization called the Youth Sentencing Reentry Project, and how it would be focused on mitigation and reentry work. I was always thinking about, like, what do I want to do when I get out? I know I wanted to work with young people. I'd had all these multiple years of doing legal work, so I understood, how to read law, and particularly laws that pertain to my circumstances. One, I had a guilty plea, so I understood guilty pleas pretty well, and also young people. The laws are concerning how young people are tried and treated as adults. So I understood those scenarios. So I wanted to be able to utilize that experience. I remember when I first came out, actually before I got out, they used to come up, and I remember sharing with them my resume. And believe me, like, it really was innocently, I was trying to sharpen up my resume so that I can send it out to different places. When I came out, I actually tried to look at there's a place in right outside of Philadelphia called St. Gabe's. They take young people. I was sending my resume to different people, but I sent it to them, and they wrote some comments on it, like, telling me correct this, correct that, correct that. But also they told me, like, see us when you get out. And I was like, ooh, that felt good. But one of the things my brother always told me was, don't believe nothing until it actually happens.
Mm.
He had been incarcerated before, and people promise people things, and then when you get out, it's a whole different story. So what happened is initially when I came out, because I was a part of the Inside Out prison exchange program, I was invited to come work for the Inside Out prison exchange program. They were the first group organization that I came with, and part of I understood it is that they didn't want to rush me. They wanted to allow me to like acclimate myself back to the community rather than like, here, do you want to work with us and do this, that? No, like give me the space to allow me to find myself in the community. But I think one of the things that happened is I came out running, and then they approached me and said, we would like to present an idea to you. And that's when they came to me and they asked me would I want to work with them.
You're obviously such an incredible human. I can see why they'd be like, oh, come see us. But, I'm thinking we really haven't discussed what reentry is. So, like, for somebody who's been incarcerated for a really long time, when they get the opportunity to be released, when they are released, they have so many obstacles that they face. If you've been incarcerated for 30 years, you don't have an ID. How do you even get a preliminary ID? And without an ID, you can't apply for jobs, you can't apply for housing, you can't apply for health benefits, you can't apply for anything. So it seems like such a small thing and has tremendous consequences. And then, of course, some folks have family who are there for them when they get out, but others are really on their own, particularly if they've been incarcerated for a long time. And so re-entering society is really challenging.
Yeah, it is. It is.
What are you doing as a reentry coordinator?
So one of the things we recognize is that reentry is not they said that cookie cutter approach that, one thing fits everybody, because we recognize that individuals have their own unique challenges and needs. And so that's one of the things I think you really have to like consider. So like you just brought up some good points in terms of what some of essential needs might be. Yes, essential need could be you need your ID. You need your social security. You need your birth certificate. You need these fundamental things. You want to apply for a job. Okay. You need health care when you get out. Okay. Then eventually you need a place to stay. Those are like fundamental things that people need. But one of the things I think that's unique to the work that we do at YSRP is that we recognize that there's a historical trauma that exists amongst many of the young client partners that we work with. Many of the client partners we work with are children of color, and they come from environments that are saturated with trauma. And so one of the things we try to do is we try to take that perspective and consider that perspective. And so when we're trying to help them to transition back to the community, how are we connecting them with resources that understand that background? Because that's important. Because you can go and try to just connect up with anybody, and then you get re-traumatized because you're not connecting to people who are sensitive to that particular background. And so I think that is a key element of the work that YSRP do, is to recognize that historical trauma and to be able to identify resources that is also sensitive to that historical trauma that many of the client partners that we work with are connected to.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much intergenerational trauma. There's
Yeah.
trauma often from the communities in which people are raised, right? They experience violence, they see violence around them. Maybe there's addiction in their immediate surroundings. And
Yeah.
then, of course, prison, which we use as this way to incapacitate and punish. That experience itself can be very traumatizing because there's tremendous violence and deprivation in prison. So the work you're doing is tremendously important, not just to meet those initial needs, but also to help heal some of those traumatic experiences and what people carry with them.
Well, the benefit of like having someone like me or someone who's been, through the experience already to connect with individuals who are coming through is that we've been through it already. We know the different nuances that many of the client partners that we're working with that they're going to face. And so when we sit there and we talk to them, there's not nothing that I haven't been through already. Yes, we recognize that it is individualized, and in the sense that what you might encounter and how you interact with that might be different than how I interact with it. but I'm probably more proximate than someone who hasn't had that experience.
I want to shift gears with you for a minute, if you don't mind. What I'd like to talk about is the crime that landed you in prison for juvenile life without parole. You were 17 in 1985. You committed an attempted robbery, and the person who you tried to rob wound up dying about 10 days after the incident from their injuries. And then you were convicted of second-degree murder and you received a mandatory sentence. The judge had to impose that on you. It was required in the state of Pennsylvania. And I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little bit about what was happening for you, that 17-year-old you,
Yeah.
and sort of how you reacted to that crime that you committed and the sentence you received.
Yeah. Yes, I think, and I see this pretty often, with young people that I deal with. I'm actually right in the process right now of producing a documentary about systemic inequality that exists in marginalized communities and how I believe it contributes to, children making bad decisions. And in my particular case, I was a young person, and I say I probably was not unlike most young people in terms of aspirations. I enjoyed playing sports, and I tell people I now it might be a bad thing, but I said I wanted to be a police officer. These were admirations of mine as a young person. But as I started to like drift in terms of just hanging out in the streets, and my hanging out in the streets came primarily because I grew up with a single mother raising 11 children. And so oftentimes when I used to like go out and just play sports and stuff, and that's how it started off, just innocently playing sports. And for many years, that's what I did. But I began to see other things. I began to see other things that exist in the community, and I began to become curious about many of those things. And some of the things that I seen were done by individuals that I looked up to. So I wanted these similar things, these nice clothing, and getting certain, I think, levels of respect that you thought was important amongst your peers. And so these were the things that I started to, I think, eventually drift towards. And so it started off innocently, just, in terms of me. I don't know if you say innocently smoking marijuana, drinking, because that happens pretty frequent with a lot of young people, and it doesn't matter what neighborhood you grew up in. So it started off like that, but eventually it started graduating into what are the things that they're doing. And some of the things they were doing were negative things, such as robbing people to get money, to be able to get those fancy clothes. And so I started to drift towards those things. I say that I had a very short-lived life in that lifestyle because it wasn't long before I was charged with homicide. So let's say I wasn't charged with homicide first. I was just charged with robbery, aggravated assault, and possession of instrument of crime. And I knew immediately then I wanted to do something different. I knew that. I wanted to do something different. And so my goal was, okay, they're probably going to send me to a youth facility. I can focus on getting my GED. I can focus on getting myself together. Unfortunately, 10 days later, police came to get me. And as they came to get me, I remember getting into what we referred to back in the day, paddy wagons. I remember getting into the police, a van, and they said, the man that you hit upside the head, they said he passed away. And I really couldn't even think past that moment because I just start crying, like thinking about this is the worst thing, that you could think of, someone, you being responsible for someone's life. And so I remember just crying, and I remember them taking me down to the police station and waiting for my mother because I was young. So the law is that they can't talk to you without the presence of interested in informed adults. So they're waiting for my mother. And then I remember her coming in and she crying and we both just crying. And I just couldn't really think past that moment. I tell people that I actually thought about I wanted to die because I was so overwhelmed with pressure, just thinking about not knowing what's going to happen to me at this point. And so, eventually things settled down a little bit. And without any and this is part of the legal system. And I tell people that there's a difference between like wanting to be responsible but also having an effective an attorney that's going to get the best outcome for your life. And this is where my attorney just simply said, what's called, I want you to plead guilty. without even like sitting down and really getting to know me, knowing my background, what my potential was. She just simply said, I want you to plead guilty. And so to second degree, and I'm like, how much time is that? And so she convinced me and my mother and my father that I would only do 10 to 15 years in prison. And so I didn't know that a life sentence meant life without the possibility of parole. Even if you told me that it's life, I didn't know what a life sentence was because I didn't know the law. And so I pled guilty under those pretenses that I would only be doing 10 to 15 years in prison. And then I subsequently learned once I went to state prison and I started talking to some of the older guys that's been incarcerated for a while that I had in fact pled guilty to a life sentence. And so immediately I started the appeal process. That was what led up to it, me ultimately getting a life sentence. And I think part of my naiveness, I think, helped me very much during the early stages because I didn't know what a life sentence meant. I actually thought I was going to get out at a certain point in time. I started learning about what life meant as time started going on, and I started seeing people who had been incarcerated going home.
It's an interesting thing that you pled guilty to the top charge and didn't get a reduced sentence because you couldn't. That was the law.
So it was not the top charge because first degree is the top charge. And first degree, you could get the death penalty or life sentence. I subsequently learned that, there was no way that I would have got the death penalty because it wasn't a death penalty case. It was a felony homicide. It was unintentional. But in Pennsylvania, the law had changed. So this is like 1974. Second degree used to be like 10 to 20. You can get 10 to 20 years. They changed the law, as you begin to see this get tough on crime. That was one of those stages where they begin to elevate, and they elevated second degree to a mandatory life sentence. So really, only distinguishing factor between second degree and first degree was that first degree, you can get the death penalty.
Again, for people who aren't familiar with felony murder, I mean, this is the scenario where John participated in a felony, an attempted robbery. And in the course of that robbery, someone died. And in his case, someone died 10 days later. But, it wasn't an intentional murder. It was a murder that occurred in the context of the felony. Now, John, when you came home after 3 decades in prison, that must have just been so hard. It's a whole new world out there with all the new technology and cell phones and everything else. And you started a group called Life After Life. And it was so impactful and it was so empowering. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that project.
We started the group Life After Life because many of us had served a significant amount of time. And what we knew that there were going to be significant challenges for individuals. And so we wanted to be able to create spaces in which we could support one another. And so we came up with the group with the idea that as individuals are transitioning back to the community, we would have that support for each other. And part of the reason why is because while inside, we were our greatest supporters. So we figured that we would transition that out back into the community to be able to continue to support each other now, existing out in the community now.
It's a really brilliant idea. Now, you have been free for quite a number of years. I'm just wondering if you could identify one or two, what are the things that you most enjoy now about being on the outside?
Obviously, I prefer to be on the outside. There's plenty more opportunities, and with regard to just thinking about like things that you want to do, you could reach goals that you set out for yourself without those things, being hindered. But I think, when I think about without getting like really deep, I think it's about treating human beings with certain levels of dignity. I think prison can be a place where you're treated, I think, in an indignified way that actually, I think, takes away your humanity. I've heard someone say, no one can take away your humanity. Well, they can sure try to, and that's where the problem comes. I think, just the concept, I think, in many ways about prison, what it does, whether it's intentional or not. I think when you put someone in prison, particularly for a significant amount of time, I think essentially that's what you do. You're stripping away their humanity, or the attempt is to strip away their humanity. To me, just being able to be treated, I think, in a humane way is so important. It makes me appreciate, I think, just the freedom that I have, but also, those who are incarcerated in terms of why I want to see them in a better situation for themselves. So that I think is probably one of the biggest things, because I think being treated in a humane way and dignified way, I think it opens up so many doors. I have a particular theory. So my experience was that when I went out, I had a job. I knew I had a job coming to me because it was already offered to me. So I didn't have to worry about a job. I had a family. My family was there because I got a big family. They were there. And so, like, what were the big challenges? And one of the big challenges was that the unknown. You didn't know what it was going to be like in terms of transition back. But I remember one particular day. I think I'd been home for a couple of days, and I remember saying to myself intentionally, I need to just get out because I've been around a bunch of people all the time. And I said, I need to get out now and just walk. And I remember going out and walking, and I said, I'm going to walk to 7-Eleven because I, haven't walked like some distance free on my own yet. And so I remember just walking, and I remember like not knowing exactly where I was at. I remember seeing a police officer, and then inside of prison, generally what happens is you view police officers as adversarials, because that's the nature of the relationship that you have while in prison. But I said to myself, I need to find out where I'm going, and I had to make an intentional decision about I need to engage him. And so I engaged him. I asked him like, "Where's 7-Eleven?" And he told me, and so I still just kept walking. So that was a moment though, because I had to think through that process. So I kept walking, and I didn't see 7-Eleven, and I was using my navigator on my phone too, and I didn't know. This is only a couple days. I'm trying to figure this out, and it's telling me keep walking, and I'm just walking, and I got lost, and I got lost in the sense that it took me to a longer 7-Elevens, so far further. But it was one of probably the greatest walks that I had, because what it did was I saw people walking past me with dogs. I saw cars driving past me, and all of this was the freedom that I think oftentimes people take for granted. But it was freedom for me in terms of me learning how to make decisions, being stimulated by all of the different elements that exist outside. And so what came to my mind about that particular moment was all of the senses that we have that we grow from: touch, taste, smell, all of these things that we grow from that allows us to be stimulated and grow. That people who are incarcerated are denied these things. They're denied, the naturalness that comes with the touch, taste, smell, all that kind of stuff. And so what I start thinking about to myself long term, I said, that is a crime. Like when you are taking away someone's humanity, it's a crime. And that I don't know if we look at it in that same way. But that shouldn't be the goal of holding someone accountable. That shouldn't be the goal, because I think you do more damage to human beings when you're doing that. And so I said that's something we need to explore a little bit further.
I mean, that's a beautiful story. I love that image of you trying to find the 7-Eleven,
And getting lost, getting
and
lost.
getting lost and getting found,
Yeah,
right? Getting lost,
yes,
but getting
yeah.
found. Yeah. Well, I'm going to finish up with a final question that I ask everybody who comes on the show. Well, in a slightly different way for you, which is that, you clearly have done such tremendous work inside and outside. You are an example of why second chances are so important. Do you think that you are the exception to the rule, or do you think that most people in prison should have access to a second chance?
I definitely don't think I am the exception. I agree. I do believe most people deserve a second chance. One of the things I try to tell people is that when I think about, people say, well, this person, he's still bad. They doing all that. Well, we all grow, and we all grow in different ways, and sometimes it takes some people a little longer. And then there's some people who get it very quick, that they don't require to do 31 years in prison. Because I think that I could have functioned well in society without doing 31 years, you know? So I definitely don't believe that I am the exception, and I do believe that I think this is why I said the work that I do in terms of with YSRP being a reentry coordinator, that we recognize the historical background that many of these people come from. That if we put that in context, I think we understand their struggles and challenges a little bit better, and then we start identifying, I think, the resources that can help them, through whatever it is that they're going through. But just the general question in terms of being an exception, there's no question. I definitely don't think that I'm the exception. I think people need to be, as I gave you an example early, that I was proximate to many opportunities, and I know that made a big difference in my life. Can we start thinking about, how do we help people to get proximate to resources that can help them? I ain't gonna just say make better decisions, but just to connect them to these resources that allow them to be able to utilize them in the way that which they could be utilized. One of the benefits I saw, when I got out, and because you brought up the article, and many of the individuals who were incarcerated still at the time, they had not come home at the time, and they said they remember reading the articles, and they like, wow, they letting us do these things. Well, that just inspired them. That inspired them to say, I want to get out, and I want to, and many of them have come out since, and they doing wonderful things because it was the things that were featured about what I was doing that inspired them to say, I want to do those things.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on Just Justice and for sharing your story of inspiration and hope for so many other people. Thank you for the good work that you're doing, and it really was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure of mine as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Just Justice. If you like what you heard, please follow us wherever you listen to podcasts and tell a friend. To share an idea for the show or to stay in touch, head to jessicahenryjustice.com or find me on the socials at Jessica Henry Justice. See you next time.